Incidentally, you may know that Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, was born on April 16th in the year 1927. That was Holy Saturday that year. And in those days, the Easter Vigil was celebrated in the morning. So he was born at 4:30 or 4:15 a.m. on Saturday. A few hours later, his obviously very robust mother brought him to the parish church at Marktel am Inn, and he was baptized. He was the first person baptized in the Holy Saturday liturgy of that year. So both his natural life and his supernatural life began at the very heart of the Paschal mystery, and he himself has taken that as a providential sign that his life is to be a liturgical life. That's why his book on the liturgy, I think, is the most important book, and one of the few books he's written as a book. Until he came out with this book, Jesus of Nazareth, most of his books were just collections of articles. But this book was written with a purpose as a book and not as a series of articles. In this book, he reviews the various aspects of the Mass. The most important, and he dedicates a whole chapter to this and speaks of it in other chapters, is perhaps the one symbol which people take for a symbol of the council, although it's not, and that is Mass facing the people. The Vatican Council said nothing about Mass facing the people, one way or the other. They clearly intended that Mass would continue to be celebrated facing the Lord or facing east. And in this book, Cardinal Ratzinger shows that was the tradition, an apostolic tradition, that is, goes back to the apostles, and the reason for it primarily is that the east is where the sun rises, and that's a symbol of the resurrection, of the risen Lord coming to us, and Christians prayed facing the rising sun as a sign that we were a people, a pilgrim people on a journey to the end time, to the Lord. And the sun also is a sign of the cosmos, it's a sign of the universe, and the Mass is not just a community coming to God, it's the whole universe turning back to God. So he sees that as an important way and a very symbolic way of celebrating the Mass. And he points out that nowhere in Christian tradition was Mass ever celebrated facing the people, with one or two perhaps anomalous exceptions. It only became a practice because that's what Martin Luther did when he wanted to reject the Mass as a sacrifice and make it only a meal. He points out in the book that there were two reasons why the theological liturgists proposed that we should change from facing east together to facing each other in the Mass. And both of them, he says, are fallacious. The first reason was the Last Supper. There are many pictures of the Last Supper which show the apostles on both sides of the table. He says, it's not the way it was, or behind the table facing the people. There were no people there. It was all apostles, and it was a semicircle, most likely, and they were facing all the same direction. That was the way they had meals in the ancient world. So even if we thought we should take the Last Supper as the basis for this, and that's questionable because the Last Supper is only part of the mystery, the cross on Good Friday is the other part. Even if it were, we have no evidence that the Last Supper was the Mass facing the people. The second reason they gave was St. Peter's Church. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, in fact, does not face east, it faces west, and that's for topological reasons of the tomb of Peter being underneath it. And so when the bishop or the Pope himself would celebrate Mass in St. Peter's, for the Eucharistic prayer, he would face east. That is the open doors, front doors of St. Peter's Basilica. But at the end of his homily, the deacon would sing out Conversi ad Dominum, which means being turned to the Lord. And for the prayer of the Eucharist, all the people would turn and face east also. So in a certain sense, it was the people who had their backs to the priest when Mass was celebrated in St. Peter's Basilica. So neither one of these historical examples actually demonstrate what the modern liturgists thought they did. And the whole movement towards Mass facing the people was legitimate, and that does have some symbolic value, which can help us. It emphasizes community. Nevertheless, it's an innovation. It's an innovation which didn't exist before. And Cardinal Ratzinger says very clearly on page 70 in this book that wherever possible, the apostolic tradition of facing east should be followed both in the building of our churches and in the celebration of the Eucharist, wherever possible. This clearly is something which he has dear to his heart, but he's a scholar who's also done the research on this. And I think the Motu Proprio is intended not to force people to celebrate Mass facing east or facing the Lord, but rather to let people have the opportunity to do that. Now, there's a very important symbolic value to this, because at the beginning of the Mass, the priest will be proclaiming the gospel and explaining the gospel. He there represents God speaking to his people. And so it's appropriate to have a face-to-face relationship. And when the people respond with the antiphonal psalms, that again is part of a dialogue. But at that moment, when the liturgy of the word is complete, the gifts are brought up, and then the priest represents the people before God. Not God before the people before God. Takes the gifts and offers them to the Father, asks the Holy Spirit to come upon them, and they become truly the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus. And that sacrifice, having been offered now, is brought back to the people, transformed, and now the priest, once again, bringing God to the people, faces them in the communion service. So you see there's a back and forth, there's a dramatic, dynamism to Mass facing the people. By the way, the Holy Father, then Cardinal Ratzinger, in his book, is emphatic about saying it should not be called Mass with the back to the people. That's a total misunderstanding, he says, of what's going on. I like to think of General Patton on his way to Berlin, leading the Third Army in World War II. I mean, he was leading them. No one says he turned his back on his soldiers. So I think that's an important factor. As I've said, there's nothing in the Second Vatican Council which speaks of or even discusses Mass facing the people. It's legitimate. I've done it over 10,000 times myself. I think it can be done reverently and beautifully. But it does represent a discontinuity from, a break from a tradition that went before. And I think at least the option of more frequently celebrating it in a more traditional way is the thing which will help heal divisions in the Church and reunite us not only with each other, but with Christians of the past. So that's the Motu Proprio. It's what it says. I believe its intention is to help reconcile, the Holy Father said that, and both forms that are mutually support and enhance each other. That'll take some time, but I'm looking forward to a time of real growth and genuine reform in the Church as a result of this very significant document, which I think may be as significant for the first half of the 21st century as Humani Vitae was for the second half of the 20th century.